Good evening, dear fellow members of the Architectural Association and guests and friends and colleagues. My name is John Palmesino and I'm welcoming you to the AA Public Program. And this evening we are gonna have a discussion with Eyal Weizman and myself. I am one of the diploma tutors or masters here at the school, and I will be in discussion with Eyal Weizman, who is a professor at University of London, at Goldsmiths, and at multiple other prestigious academic institutions like Princeton and further afield in Israel, Palestine, practicing architect, founder of a fantastic organization called Decolonizing Architecture. And of course, this evening here to present his book that also carries the name of his new agency, Forensic Architecture. And Eyal doesn't need much presentation here at school because he is one of our alumni, and it's great to have Eyal back at school, and in order to discuss this evening his latest book, but it's actually not his latest work, because Eyal's latest work is always the one that might appear in the newspaper tomorrow, rather than in a book format that is now becoming somehow the interval format for Eyal. No? He's been a fantastic and very prolific author of multiple books, innumerable articles, contributions, buildings, exhibitions, and public displays of architectural thought and innovation. So please join me in welcoming back at the AA Eyal Weizman. Tonight is really to celebrate the appearing of this beautiful volume by Zone Books. And what we were discussing is that we would like to actually carry on a set of conversations that have started, it's embarrassing to say, almost 18 years ago. It's been an uninterrupted set of discussions with Eyal over the last, over the two first parts of the new decades of the 21st century. And there have been horrible moments over the last 17, 18 years, almost constant aggressions, almost constant upheavals, almost constant disquieting moments that somehow we started addressing from architectural point of view. And it is this constant violence that we've experienced since the end of last century that has become somehow the central figures that have been our set of preoccupations over the last years. And of course, the subtitle of Eyal's fantastic new book is Violence at the Threshold of Detectability. And so we'll start maybe this evening by addressing some of the questions that Eyal is putting forward in the book, but maybe just a little bit of context, and we could do it maybe together, about the major title, Forensic Architecture, which is somehow both a proposition in the sense that it's the adjective attached to architecture is apparently the most important element in addressing an architectural audience. So it's not just architecture, it's forensic architecture. But usually in other contexts, rather than an architectural school, the forensic appears the less important of the two terms, but architecture becomes the questionable condition. So forensic architecture as a joint name which somehow echoes another joint name, which is research architecture, which is the institution that we both inhabit at Goldsmiths. So maybe, Eyal, you can tell us something about forensic and architecture and research and architecture, and the difficult relations of these words.
So, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for the introduction. It's always wonderful to be here again. It's like home. In relation to the question, I think that there is a rather straightforward way to describe what forensic architecture is, and this is the production of evidence, of architectural evidence. And its presentation in juridical and sometimes political forums, and we could go through them. So forensic architecture now present evidence in various court cases internationally. It presents evidence within human rights reports or to human rights commissions. We presented evidence in the UN, in the UN General Council. We presented various types of evidence within citizen-organized truth commissions and tribunals. So that's a very kind of straightforward definition. But you asked something that I think kind of is more interesting, because when you take two terms like forensic and architecture, each with its own long disciplinary history, it's suffocating. No, now you even put them together. No, forensics as the really like the art of the state, in which the state polices, surveys, catalogs, archives information about individuals. A very institutionalized practice that kind of surrenders or determined by all sort of protocols. Juridical protocols are extremely rigid, with its own sets of institutions that authorize what could be said and what could not be said, and how what is said is being said. So, and of course, architecture itself with its own disciplinary baggage. Now you put both of them together, it sounds like a total nightmare. But I think that somehow each one of those very rigid disciplinary frame somehow destabilizes the other. Because by putting forensic next to architecture, the first thing that we would claim is, or that we must, something very basic that must be said, is that the architecture in forensic architecture is not really the kind of design and construction of inhabitable space, but it's an analytical frame. It's an investigative mode. So architecture becomes something like an optic with which you start reading things which are outside of architecture, say, violation of this form or another. So it turns, forensic demands that architecture becomes an investigative tool. So when, to a certain extent, we all here, and when I was trained here, and we are thinking about the history of architecture, and somehow the history of architecture has been very much the history of architects rather than the history of architecture, or the history of architects rather than the history of buildings. So there is a kind of a way in which that notion gets a little bit displaced, because what we do in forensic architecture is we tell bits of history, and it could be a micro-history of a split-second scenario in which usually, if it's us, if we get a commission, somebody ends up being shot. Or other forms of micro-incidents. Sometimes it's very, it's in a long duration. But we tell a history, when we tell a history through the way in which the event has become space, in which the event not only bear traces on space, but in which events produce space, right? So in that sense, if you would say there is a field of forces that operate in the vicinity of built matter and continuously shape it, you could read something of that force field by looking at form, right? Again, it's a very simplified, rather mechanical notion. of the inversion of both architecture and architectural history, right? Because we're not, the author of the architectural product that we are looking at is not the architect. Could be, I don't know, an earthquake, could be, you know, bits of violence, could be bombing, could be any of those sorts of things. We're thinking of them as formative forces rather than authorship in that sense. Then architecture does something strange to forensics, because forensics, as we understand it to be, and this is something I always repeat when I speak about forensic architecture, forensics in Latin is that which pertains to the forum. To a certain extent, forensics is the art of the forum. It means that to make a claim, to tell a bit of architectural history or bit of history, it's not simply the analysis. It's the presentation in a forum, and sometimes it's the very production of forums that becomes important. So, and here is where forensic architecture is also different than, you know, criminal forensics. Because in criminal forensics, that is operated by the police as a state practice. The state has its own institutions like the police, the courts, etc. Everything is regulated by protocol. But when you practice something that we call counter-forensics, i.e. it's not the police as the state that surveys civilians, but you invert the forensic gaze and you have citizens, or, well, citizens are sometimes also overdetermined, but let's say civil society looking at the violence of states, of corporations, etc. You don't have the forums that you need in order to bring claims. So when we gather, let's say, evidence as we have recently against American drone strike in Syria, where about 50 civilians got killed, and we could show that the Pentagon was lying about that fact. In fact, the Pentagon has retracted their claim based on our analysis. There is no court in which we can bring that claim. That doesn't exist. The field of human rights forensics or civil society forensics or counter-forensics, which are all kind of synonyms, is chaotic, is completely chaotic. So in a sense, the architecture in forensic architecture means a certain form of gathering, of construction of forums in order for the claim to be heard, right? The claim cannot exist within this, within the space in which it needs to become political. It needs the forum. And sometimes you need to gather the forums in order to make forensics. So I think each of these terms somehow disturbs a little bit the solid definition of the other. But very practically, forensic architecture is now an agency. We're still based at Goldsmiths, but we're not directly Goldsmiths employees. We get some services from them. We're about 15 or 20 of us. We do at the same time about 6-7 projects worldwide. Again, commissions from Greenpeace through courts in Germany or stuff like that. It's also, at the same time, it's a way through the practice to try to define try to sketch out the contour of what this quasi sub-discipline of architecture might be. So we try to understand what it is through actually practicing it under very basic proposition and then kind of putting flesh through the cases themselves.
It seems to me that the conditions that you highlight, and that of the gathering moment and the conditions of pushing the notion of, say, the creation of the forum at the same time as having understand it to be one of the conditions that somehow seems to permeate the entire work, not only in its almost direct reference to the war machine in the Lösengatterie, but both is articulated as the gathering of the priest and the somehow capacity of ordering of the captain or the hero or the military chief. But this mirroring condition is also seen to me in the condition through which your practice operates by assembling a lot of patterns, a lot of what you might usually consider pattern recognition of events, forms, and then propelling them in order to create a new structure. And this obviously is linked to the notion of violence. And it seems that the conditions of violence are here understood not only in the scandalous conditions of crimes and killing, but really as one of the ways through which history of architecture, as you explain it, or the making of architecture, operates as a violent condition. That means always as a condition that somehow escapes the possibilities of its complete apprehension and cuts across modes of comprehending. Somehow there's an excess in the events that is only perceivable through a series of very complex working out. And the excess of architecture, in that sense, I think is what seems to be the most impressive element here. No? There's an excess of architecture. Architecture is no longer limited to what you might think of as that which is built by architects. Architecture becomes the settlement of a nomadic group at the edge of the state. Architecture becomes traces in trees. Architecture becomes non-human shelter. Architecture is somehow in excess. I think that one of the aspects of that is really striking in the book is that on one side, you might think that it's very niche practice, that it's really pertaining those that are somehow always astray by the news, always picked up by the latest event, and somehow it's limited to the people that think that architecture should be a way of practice. But on the other side, there is a sort of proliferation of architecture at every page. And your writing seems really to reveal architectural conditions in the most unexpected places. Somehow there's sort of contradiction in these two aspects of the book that is quite astonishing. And maybe we could say something about that in the way that you conceptualize the book, which is one long sustained argument, basically divided in three large parts, then it's constantly interrupted by what we might call cases or files, evidence, and the construction of the case. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that from the point of view of the excess of architecture, the excess of the event.
Yeah, so, I think that's definitely a productive way to discuss that. Only that, we need to understand there's so many ways in kind of trying to define what constitutes violence and where we can speak about simply a processes of formation, right? If you say that if you look at it architecturally, if you look at cities architecturally, and you look at the kind of the stuff that they are undergoing, including all the creative destruction and reconstruction and transformation that is going on, the conflicts that are part and parcel, that are kind of completely infused within all, client-architect relation, financial, labor, finance law, capital relation, etc. To put a sort of, to define them as violence is obviously a kind of a normative decision, right? It's to say, what is that which needs to, which exactly define the threshold of excess? What is the kind of level of conflict and what you can do during that conflict that is considered acceptable? And I think that threshold of acceptability is constantly something that is shifting. And what is interesting to look at it is not to look at kind of the obvious thing that, of course, homicide, or kind of a friendly debate on both ends, but to look what constitute the thresholds and how the threshold of violence, what constitutes violence, is defined, and what's the relationship between it and law. What's the relation between it and how you constitute what is a human? How should we live together? How should we, cultivate or preserve physical environments, etc. So first of all, we need to the definition of violence is a normative decision that continuously redefine the field of politics. What is within politics and what is outside of politics, or what is the relationship between violence and politics. But in what way you can draw that boundary. And of course, in the field of human rights, it's a much more chaotic field than within sort of a criminal system when you come to think about it. So for us, very often, the conditions of violence accelerates and make very distinct the collision of forces that perhaps are overall, right? And allow you to see in a more diagrammatic sense those sets of relations. So, I mean, here on the cover, for example, is an image of a project in Gaza that we undertook in 2015 over the violence in Gaza in 2014. The problem was that we had some 70,000 images, but we didn't know how to order them and how to locate them. What we needed to do was to look architecturally at the sky, right? So, and to say, well, those bomb clouds are architecture in gas form. Those bomb clouds that exist for about 8 to 10 minutes, right, from the time a bomb hits the ground, low pressure is created. When it sucks in all the debris, it rises as a column of dust until the pressure evens out with the atmosphere and opens up like in this sort of mushroom that kind of start falling onto its shadow, right? That kind of cycle that takes 8 minutes is a building in gas form. It's an accelerated building, right? And every building, but what it does, it shows you something which is true of every piece of architecture. Every building continuously transforms, and its transformation is what we attune to. So rather than sort of looking at buildings as static elements, we will always be tuned to the way in which they transform and how these transformations, whether they're micro vibration on the envelope or a complete transformation of a building into a cloud, we would map it out, and in that situation, using the kind of software, the kind of approaches that some people use in a school like that, like mapping out dynamic blob-like forms, allow you to basically sync up the entire battle. Because whenever we saw that cloud, we knew that all images that had this cloud in it are at the same time, but the cloud gave us different direction that we look at it, created the meteorology of the sky, the architecture of the sky, and inverted it to the earth. But this also shows you something that is, I think, another thing that is interesting, and that is, for us right now, the kind of the figure, the very banal figure of the surveyor, of a building surveyor, is very interesting. Because I think that building surveyors understand something basic about architecture that some architects forget, and that is that a building is a dynamic system that continuously transforms, and that its transformation is the information that you need. Deformation, that is matter information, is information, right? For a building surveyor, the band of a beam or of a ceiling, of the paint, is information that operates in relation to other systems. So you would read from it, obviously, very basic. What's the temperature inside? Is it too hot? Are there too many people inside? Is it, what's happening outside in terms of pollution? Or those things are registered in the material dynamics of a building that are read like a diagram in that sense. And that is to say that the building become like a sensor, right? And I think that buildings are very good political sensors because, every bit of material reality, we could think of it as a sensor of force fields that are applied on it. In many ways, every bit of material reality is both, could be seen as both presence and representation, right? It has a physical presence, but it is shaped by or imprinted by the forces around it. It could later communicate outwards. But I think that buildings are special kind of sensors because, again, they are dynamic, non-linear one, right? I mean, if you say quicksilver is a very simple linear sensor. The hotter it gets, the more volume it gets, and you can read the temperature from it. When you start looking at the dynamic transformation of architecture composed out of thousands of bits of material that are hanging more or less, often less well, with each other, and start reading it, that form of reading becomes very complicated and could be, in many situations, reading the architectural transformation is a kind of a sensor of sorts to political forces. But obviously, it's also a kind of sensor that is affecting the situation that it registers. So what is it? Is it between an agent, right? It's sometimes the mean of violation or the mean of action and the mode of registering it. So you have to always exist on a threshold between these forms of readings if you want to undertake a kind of building survey that is conceptually more, interesting than just the, litigational sort of stuff that you do for insurance reports, etc. But still, no. I mean, in the figure of the building surveyor, there is another model of architectural history, which is the history of a building, a material through time, rather than only the history of architects. That is intention translated to notation to built reality.
Here again, it seems to me that violence is what you are really putting forth. The application of force is what you're describing. Architecture as the registration of the application of forces, which is saying architecture as the registration of violence. Violence is nothing else than a vehement condition, where forces are somehow under condition of no longer being controlled. And so the interesting condition that I think images like this and the entire setup of the account of one full day of the attacks in and on Gaza is a registration of these forces. But it seems to me that there is something more going on here. It's not simply that we have an absolute idea that the world is shaped by forces and then there's accidents where we can start detecting them. It seems to me that what is going on here is a sort of inversion of sort of a canonical condition of Western thought, where there's an absolute and then there's a local accident, which is always somehow the condition of locality. And so it seems, which is also a very normative condition of architecture. There's absolute and then there's the contingent. It seems to me that what you're doing here is an inversion. The contingent is the only condition that we can appear to get grasp of, and there's never the absolute forces, but the absolute forces are nevertheless accounted for in their excess of violence and excess of, and it's phenomenal, I think, this case of Gaza, because the event here is almost the full cycle of architecture, from the construction processes all the way to the myriad of particles in the form of smoke and descending and intoxicating with bits and pieces of plastic, rubble, and of course humans, the very inhabitants. So the idea that architecture is something that you completely inhabit through its violence is reduced here as a history of a moment. The event here is much more than what you can make of it, but it's only through the very complex architectural construction. So the question I have here, Eyal, is about the fact that the insistence on the debris, the insistence on the rubble and the destruction has been somehow one of the elements that has been thrown back at the discussion. Why is it always so violent? Why is it that you have to constantly engage with these death and horrible conditions? So the disordering, the dismembrance, all these words that are starting with this are usually associated with the work. Well, on the contrary, I think that what is really at stake is an understanding of the process of construction and reconstruction and transformation, not as a distinction between the, say, categories of absolute. No, they constantly need to be reconstituted, reconstructed, and architecture is simultaneously the advancement and the destruction, which is an archaeological understanding, almost an understanding of the constant reinscription, and no longer even capable of distinguishing sign from the actual material condition that carry that sign. And the work is largely, of course, associated with notions of archaeology, of anthropology, the condition through which the humanities have approached the material world, and by approaching the material world started undoing the distinction between the ideal and the material. And it seems to me that the work here is not only associating the discipline of architecture to the disciplines of, say, forensic sciences, but it's also trying to make a claim about architecture vis-a-vis these other conditions where the humanities and the sciences are somehow more clearly articulated as fields of practices. Can you tell us something about the fact that the locus of all of this research is really in an institution that starts off a little bit titubant about that distinction, something also that maybe is permeating this work, and maybe we can go through some of the cases and tell us about the environment where they were produced, because it seems to me that the institutional conditions of the production of the work are well beyond simply the hosting entities. No? They somehow form an intellectual field of forces.
Yeah, I think first of all, most of our work would have to begin not with assembling knowledge on a particular case, but with dismantling all sort of forms of justification and negation that are coming by perpetrators. So the reality of our work is that by the time we would enter an investigation, and we would enter it when we are commissioned by, I don't know, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, or in fact communities that suffer violence somewhere, there's already a state narrative about it. So, and this is something that is important because state violence needs to often to present itself in a normative framework. So they would say that happened and that's okay, or that happened and that's a mistake. And they would kind of start projecting a particular narrative on a situation. And the first thing that we need to do is disrupt it, is kind of to find its weak points. And often we don't have enough resources and time to dismantle the whole thing. So we'll choose a particular weak point within a narrative and drill like deep in there. And then comes, your other question of what's the relation between the particular, the sort of singularity, and, sort of a general understanding of history, etc. What's the relation between the detail and the long duration in history? And often we find ourselves within that dilemma. For example, a lot of let's say it like that. The kind of violence that we are asked to research would move from kind of the instantaneous violence of an incident. Something happened, somebody got shot, something dropped a bomb somewhere, to all the way to the sort of the slow and long durational violence of environmental transformation, such as in a more environmental work, like in Guatemala or in Indonesia, where when we show how a particular mixture of state-supported or military-supported corporatism leads to forest fires in Indonesia or something else. So it goes from the kind of the instantaneous to the long durational. Whenever we whenever we are able finally to dismantle a state narrative, like we have very recently on a particular act of homicide, somewhere doesn't, I don't want to go into the detail, and we show that the police has killed...
Please do go in the detail.
Should I?
I think it's maybe an insight.
A case we were working for a long time with Bedouin communities in the Nakab, in the Israeli Negev desert. There was an incident where the police came to dismantle a community, a village that was there for several tens of years. They came very violently, and they said that somebody, a driver that was there, I can show this work later, tried to kill the policeman, was driving towards them in high speed with the lights off, and tried to run over the police person. And we could show that, all that is crap. Basically, they shot him first before he started driving fast. He lost control of the vehicle and ran over the police person, right? Immediately when we release that, the state kind of pushes back. The Minister of Police and Minister of Internal Security in Israel are kind of like pushing back at us. We're pushing back. All that is happening within Twitter, no? There's kind of like, we were, for the first time, in a sort of direct Twitter war with the Israeli, directly with the Israeli police. Finally, they've acknowledged that, yes, that our narrative was right. But what springs in these instances is immediately the last line of state defense, and that is the split-second argument. So what does it mean? It means that when no other argument works, it's always an argument for the defense. The police or the lawyers of a police person would say that police person had to make a split-second decision. The split-second decision is a moment, is a very interesting duration of time, because it's a duration of time where thought is impossible, supposedly, right? So if our entire understanding of violence at least in Western tradition, is an economy of calculation, of cost-benefit, you have to do it because that's the lesser evil, or proportional violence, etc. It's kind of, it's economized. In those moments of split-second self-defense, you are not a political subject. You do not make a choice. It's muscle memory. There's something like the animal in you defends yourself, like something flies in your face and you have to instinctively catch it. And that decision means, effectively, without clarifying what is a split second, what's the duration of the split second, right? The split second is the smallest duration of legal time. It's the indivisible of legal time. It's like the pixel of time for defense lawyers. It is to say, within that moment, we cut that moment out of history, we cut that moment out of its cultural context or whatever. And it was not only in the Israeli case. We have split-second argument. Whenever we are finally successful, we come across it, that split-second argument springs up. And the question is, what exists in a split second? What can you read into the split second? And finally, of course, one could say, well, why should a police person feel threatened when a black motorist on a LA highway in 1991, Rodney King, is simply approaching him? Why should an Israeli policeman feel at all threatened when a Bedouin man is driving a car? And of course, within that split second exists the long duration of colonial violence, of slavery, of segregation, or whatever you want to call it. And the idea is really how through the small instance you can open up much wider political forces. In fact, the project that I would like to show you, or to speak about, is a project that we undertake now in Germany. And it's a project that we were commissioned to do by an organization called the People's Tribunal called the People's Tribunal on the NSU. NSU is a neo-Nazi group that so between 2000 and 2011 have killed about 10 people in Germany, always from migrant background. So mainly German from Turkish background were killed by this organization. And the police, throughout the entire sequence of killing, more or less than more, but one a year, was continuously either blaming the violence on the Turkish-German victims or completely looking at anywhere else but on racist violence. So this organization was also very worried about the way in which the trial in Germany was undertaken. The trial is unfolding in Munich. There is one surviving member of this NSU, Beate Zschäpe. She's facing criminal trials, and the state somehow, through the court, reduces the entire narrative onto, the guilt or innocence of Beate Zschäpe and does not deal with what is called the NSU complex, and that is the way in which the police, the Verfassungsschutz, which is the secret service, internal secret service in Germany, the legal authorities have somehow contributed, or at least did not stop that process from happening, right? So again, a reduction, the state reaction to violence would always to isolate it and to say that is the odd one out. That is a kind of something that is non-normative and like an excess or something like that. And the counter-forensic mode would always be to connect that split second or that particular scenario back into the world in which it is part, right? So it's like a Greek tragedy. A Greek tragedy, by definition, is a single turning of the sun. That is 24 hours. But to understand it, you need to reconstruct the politics, the economy, the cultural relation that made that day possible. So you read out from the day outwards, right? And in this particular case, a killing. So we were sitting with this group of victims, or families of victims, lawyers and the people that represent them. And rather than covering and researching the entire set of operation, we said we're going to research one case, 177 square meters of a shop in Kassel, in which one of those killings took place, or a neo-Nazi has killed Halit Yozgat, a German from Turkish background who was manning the counter of this shop. Because within that shop, within those 77 square meters and about 9.5 minutes of the duration of the event, there was also another person in that shop, and that person was a Secret Service agent, a man called Andreas Temme. By chance was there, right? He said he did not witness the event, he did not hear the shots, he did not smell the residue of the gunpowder, and he did not see the body when he went out. This is, in fact, a project we have now on with a big team. In fact, most of the team that work on it are people that previously work on investigation in Syria, in other places. Kind of, usually we think of human rights as something that happens in Europe and kind of looks at the excess in the world. That team is run by a Greek architect, Christina Varvia. It has a Syrian architect, Omar Fatawi, who is working on it, right? So a group of us, other Stefanos Levitis and other people who are working, basically looking at human rights violation of Germany. And what became very interesting for us in this case was that it was based on something that we often refer to as open source analysis, i.e., we're looking again at things that exist in the public domain. And in this particular case, what was interesting was that another neo-Nazi group actually had people, collaborators within the German police, and leaked the entire police investigation. All the files were dumped in 2015 on the public domain. And at that moment, we could undertake an investigation of the police investigation and look at the way in which those are logins. So imagine, I don't want to, I'm now speaking about it in too much detail, but what is very interesting for us in this project, and I'll not go into the full detail of it, was that when a murder happens in an internet cafe, everybody is logged in. Everybody's logged in, everybody has the time of their action is sequenced by the sites and by the opening and closing of the computer or telephones. So you start developing something like that. Okay, that's not available now. But a sort of a timeline, imagine a sort of a timeline with codes that come in and out, and an architecture that, so the entire event exists between temporal codes and spatial arrangements. And we were investigating that. We actually built a one-to-one model of that space in Berlin, and undertook a series of analysis in it, including sound analysis of the gunshots. We had somebody shooting a gun in Arizona, and we played it in the space. We had a fluid dynamics expert doing smell analysis, i.e. how the particles of sulfur in the air would behave as the this is the one-to-one model that we've undertaken, and again the media is not available, but here is some documentation of the sound analysis. This is a gun being shot in Arizona. You can shoot any gun at anyone. And so we had the sound of the gun recorded and played out in space and measured in order to show that that person would have heard it. Now the significance of it, so regardless of going into the minute details of it, and this is all going to be shown in the Documenta next week, it is that intensifying analysis on this 77 square meter in 9.5 minutes, where each one of the members, the state, the victims, and the killers are spatially and temporally arranged within space, disposed in particular relation to each other, allows you to basically force, if you, as it seems we are, proving that he has been there, force the Secret Service, the Verfassungsschutz, to come up with their scenario. and somehow from like a little hole that you drill in a particular wall allows you to kind of to crack or to move outward. So I think that the kind of the interesting relation would always be between singularities and, you know, sort of political forces, larger political forces, and how you navigate between those. And isn't that in itself the kind of the architectural conundrum, no? In a way, how do you kind of JPEG a particular set of political relation in architectural form?
One of the elements that is maybe worthwhile noting in a context like this one is the fact that the work that you're doing is not only an intervention in the formation of the production of, say, reconstructions or reorganizations of events in their sequence and the minute difficulties of that. But what you mentioned in the case of the crash into the police and who shot seems to me a way through which the rather beautiful affabulation capacity that you have in wonderful storyteller becomes a way of intervening and shaping the forum, not a forum in the institutional format, but in a sense of the conditions of public accountability, the conditions through which the aesthetical dimension are carried out through the political aesthetics of an event. And it seems to me that this is a very important moment in the discussion, because on one side you're insisting on the fact that one split second is the moment where a person is somehow independent from its technological apparatus and can only be accounted for through his, I guess, moral stance. In spite of the fact that he had a gun, there was a condition of being alert, and there was a complex network of conditions, what you call the field of forces. But the split second is always just an idea that you are accountable without technology. It's only your moral condition of a citizen that is taken into consideration. It's not whether you carry the gun. You'll still be independent, which seems to me
it's rather the opposite. It's kind of the moment where you're not accountable for any calculation, because it's reducing into an instant.
Yeah,
right?
It doesn't matter whether you have the gun or not.
Yeah.
The entire apparatus is just there, just reacted. Which is somehow the argument, of course, of those who think that, for instance, carrying the gun is not a condition that needs to be governed by legislation, which is the opposite argument of those who think that actually guns should be limited by society, because the person with the gun might become a killer in spite of his or her moral judgment, good citizenship. But that moment is where I think the instantial, the particular condition that you are describing becomes an interest in the field of forces, in the conditions in which this operate. You mentioned the Greek tragedy, the full circulation of and the unfolding and the circularity of the story in one single day, going outwards, the excess of architecture. And I think that is, for me, really an important moment, where you understand that the intervention is against that condition whereby the state always tries to limit the world into instances, into individualities that are not affected by architecture. And so it seems to me that the real gesture here is to understand that the narrative, the fact that you have to use Twitter in order to create that link with the split second and architecture is your architectural intervention. It's very interesting to understand here that it's not simply a condition through which you imagine that you have to speak about violence in order to speak about the conditions of operation of the state, but you are making a direct connection between the instance, the accident, and the overall organizations of technology in society, and the capacity of apprehending what a technological event might be, which is a very difficult debate to be had in architecture, the link between technology and formation and technology. And it seems to me one of the elements that starts appearing more and more in your work, and especially in the open source and in the investigative journalism aspect, is an idea that you're dealing with sort of a technological subjectivity that needs to be investigated, understood, apprehended in order to understand its formative potentials, rather than simply think that technology is a hype. It seems to me that in the recent work, in particular, the one that you've been quickly explaining about the German case, or the live intervention into the debate in the police in Israel, that is something that starts appearing in a new format, in a new way. And I think it's a very interesting development of the work. It's a development that somehow starts reflecting on the way that things are produced through technology, rather than simply hiding the fact that we have technology. And in this sense, it resonates so much with a complete transformation of our civic institutions, whereby we used to have the print, the press, and its very complex technological apparatus somehow safeguarding us from the misbehaviors and wrongdoings of the state. But somehow today the state seems to occupy the press, and somehow we have to resort to open source information, to distributed data, to whistleblowers. It seems to me that there's you're describing in these examples a very worrying transition that we are all going through, whereby what we thought was the institution that held us, held the state accountable, is now one of the conditions that we have to fight for. The narratives are already taken over by the state. So we have to resolve to distributed photographic uploads, to metadata, reading the data given to us by whistleblowers. Now, that's the new format of investigative journalism, and it seems to me is also becoming the format of contemporary architectural interventions and architectural production. So there's no longer the capacity of seeing the state as the institutional carrier of our, say, capacity of living together. And it's really worrying on many levels, of course. And but this is another example, I think, where forensic architecture is not about violence. It's a way through which violence is conceptualized and articulated in order to understand architecturally, from architecture, these conditions. So the question is really one about the conditions that you describe in the book, and that is the dilemmas, the uncertainties, what is not seeable, what is not apprehendable, the thresholds. I would like you now maybe to, if you could maybe go through one or two further cases and discuss them through thresholds of detectability, thresholds of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, acceptable for whom, who would guarantee that is something that is accountable, what is not accountable. What are those thresholds that you're describing in the book? Can you go through a series of thresholds?
So perhaps the most, well, the example that led to the subtitle, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability, comes out of a combination of three threshold conditions. The first is the threshold of visibility, which is, again, it's a technical term. The threshold of detectability is the moment you remember, like we spoke about the time pixel, the split second being conceptualized by law as an indivisible of time. There is an indivisible to the image, right? It could be the pixel, it could be the grain of silver salt on an analog image. It's the moment that an image breaks from representation into its technical or material form, right? So you start looking so closely, so what you start seeing are, grains of silver salt or just pixels. But thinking hard about those, you start realizing that there is a relationship between what civil society could see, which is always less than what the state could see. Again, it's an inversion, so let me make a tiny little detour. Forensics 101 since the 19th century, since Bertillon, is based on the ability of the state, that is the police, to see more than the criminal, that is an individual. Right? It needs to see more, it needs to know more. Civil society counter-forensics, investigative forensics that we do, would always have the less resolution satellite image, less access to code, less access to information, to databases, etc., whatever you need. You always operate under the threshold of detectability that the state has. So then we realized that state violence actually tends to just occur under the threshold of what civil society could see. So if you and I can buy satellite images in which the size of a pixel is 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter, the kind of ammunition that would be used would be rendered invisible from that perspective, right? So violence would operate under it. But this is one thing, that's very technical. And in that particular case that we were doing for the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, this is the stuff that I said was presented in the General Assembly in the kind of the world against US case that was unfolded in the UN against American, or to try to confront American drone strikes. The problem was that the threshold of visibility renders what cannot be seen as an object cannot be considered as an object to law also, right? So the threshold of visibility creates a certain juridical threshold. So, and then you have also a territorial threshold in which that happens. So very practically, the US has put a siege together with the Pakistanis, a siege around FATA, the federally administered tribal area in Waziristan, did not allow any cameras in and out, did not allow any journalists or human rights people in and out of that. That's a territorial threshold. The visual threshold was made by keeping reduced pixelation or increasing the pixelation on the images of that area. And that created a certain extraterritorialization that operates also as rendering something out of the image. Because you created that veil of resolution, certain types of action, like drone warfare whose signature was smaller than the pixel, could occur. Right? So this is the what you need to look when you look at threshold conditions. You always need to look at them in relation to others. So if you look at the threshold of visibility, you look at it in relation to the threshold of the law and territorial borders and thresholds. So this is something that is important. But I wanted to say something about open source and leak and hack and like the spying that states do on our smartphones and whatever. That it's an inversion of that act. Open source investigation means to say what exists already in the public domain has not been looked at there's so much information that exists in the open that you'll be completely mad to try to even get more information from what is hidden. Because for now, in situations where we research things in Syria, of course, now we have also our particular contacts and connections there, and we can do that. But we can track a car that has been photographed in a particular part of Aleppo, and we would be looking and asking people to send us pictures of that particular car because we saw it parking by a mosque that we have researched that was eventually bombed by the US, and it was, and then the mosque that they claim was not a mosque, and we show it was a mosque, and the civilians that were killed that the US claimed were militants, that were not militants, etc. Again, without going into the details that are very complicated of this case, one of the elements in it was to track one car that finally arrived there. That particular car or cars like it, very much like it, appeared in hundreds of images that you could get. So the open source is to say we need to really construct or reinvent looking, because our relation to photography has been, and the theory of photography, or the politics of photography, has been completely bound by the frame of the photograph. If you see within a single frame a perpetrator and a victim, you can, that image could be disseminated, you can speak about the pain of others or not the pain of others within it, you can analyze it or not analyze it. Today, images are simply doorways to other images. The act of looking at photography is moving either algorithmically or analog, in an analog way by kind of the connoisseurship of the eye that is developed over time, but mind you, by face recognition or by car recognition, etc., and tracking relation between images. It is the relation that matters, right? The story always slips between images, is not contained within the image. And therefore, architecture becomes incredibly important because you understand that to look at something is to construct. And its montage would not help you there. The kind of the classic or classic modernist idea of the politics of the image as either the dialectic montage of Eisenstein or any other form of kind of collapse of time-space that exists is exactly what you do not need. What you need right now is a concept of navigation. You need to navigate from one image to the next, and you need that navigation to operate in all directions. And therefore, architecture becomes the only, not that it becomes a useful tool, it becomes the only tool to watch images. And you would see that when you have an incident, say, in Syria, like the chemical attack that we researched for Human Rights Watch or anything else, you have hundreds and thousands of images. And what you need to do is to construct the time-space relationship. You need to project the perspective within space and be able to switch it on and off and to compose. So to view is to construct, and to construct, you need to construct space. It becomes an architectural practice. And this is why I think the technique that we develop becomes so now effective, and different human rights groups are either trying their own way or with our help are establishing units within there that does similar techniques that we do, because it's not like blow up, that you have an image and you can like zoom in and kind of discover things within it. It's about relation and navigation between open source data, right? What's in the public domain has not been seen. It's just there. In fact, it's not even an image until you do not call it, and you do not start looking at it in a particular way. It's data. It appears into an image the minute that you call upon it and pose questions to it and start weaving relations
well, the
with
question of how this will bring you back almost to the beginning of the scientific revolution, this almost condition where you cannot distinguish narrative from data. And how those two are linked tightly is then one that links you very quickly to the rhetoric of the project. But this is now a 1 hour conversation. I don't want to make it a complete double intervention between the two of us. We've had so many more occasions. I would like to maybe ask some of our friends and members of the audience if they would like to ask questions or make comments so that we can sort of open the discussion to more voices. If there are initial questions that we could start discussing. Maybe you want to wait for the microphone.
I'm curious as to the definition of what the split-second notion is. You say that there's a legal definition of it, but what I'm trying to understand is from what side? Is it from, a civilian's point of view, or is it from the government or, federal, etc.? So how did you come about that definition?
So usually this is what we encounter when the state or state agencies like police or military, it's the last line of justification. So it's a kind of very much an argument of legal defense. It's part of the legal defense of self-defense, right? But it makes self-defense into an instinctive act without asking how is instinct produced, right? So it's taking it out. It says, at this particular moment, you're almost a kind of a pre-political subject. You do not make calculation. It's not, it could have been, it might as well have been an enemy, a civilian, or one of your own, which you have shot in that particular moment. So the state, the legal defense of state perpetrators tries to shrink time to this kind of pixel of time, to the indivisible time that empties the subject. Or they claim a certain emptying out of the subject. Our attempt in counter-forensics, not whether it is a split second, whether it is a 77 square meter of the internet shop in 9.5 minutes, whether it's a particular incident, is to connect it back to the world of which it is part, right? The world that has produced an incident like that, what kind of world it is, and when I say world, I don't mean kind of metaphorically, very materially, what is the set of political actors, interest, forces, cultures, practices, technologies that somehow enable that particular split second, and how you can read outwards into it. So to a certain extent, we find ourselves always discovering the long duration within that it becomes so pixelated that what you see is only the sort of the history of certain kind of persecution, whether it's colonial or to do with slavery or something else, right? In the examples that I did mention. But you need to think of violence always as having various durations existing between singular moment, between patterns. John was speaking about patterns in space and time and what the pattern reveal. In fact, in law, pattern is extremely essential. So whenever you want to, let's say, in a particular Russian bombing in Syria, let's say the moment would come and somebody from the Russian military or political level would face trial for the violence in Syria. If you just bring a particular instance where civilians would have been destroyed, that would always go down to the individual pilot or soldier on the ground, right? It would kind of like shrink down to that, and you'd say that's an aberration. The minute that you show pattern and repetition, you can start drawing relation between data and between finds. So you ask, like, what's the numbers behind the numbers? What is happening? Is it a particular mimicry that happens between units? Is it cumulative radicalization? Is it an order in which you'd see a certain pattern emerging, systematic and widespread? This is kind of like the legal term, systematic and widespread, that permeates the entire battlefield at a particular moment and disappears in another when the command is withdrawn. Pattern allows you to take up, to make political those forms of violence. Then you have another level, which is the sort of what Rob Nixon called the slow duration, the slow violence of environmental transformation, of making toxic particular environment, etc. But you need to understand that they are convertible one to the other, right? At the threshold of the desert, when desertification occurs, that may erupt in particular instant, right? These are, and also we need to understand those scalar relations not as a relations of causality. It's not that you look at the large scale and you say, well, you know, that would determine now the action. Sometimes moments of singularity could create shift within the sort of the longer duration and larger phenomena, like a moment in a battle where things transform. You need to, in order to identify it, you need to look at the relations between, not only at the single kind of violation, but at the relation between them. And another thing that is very important, I wanted to just to come back to John on the issue of, that's confusing, on the issue of patterns. Pattern recognition, in fact, developed as an algorithm as a form of predictive practice, right? So it's going to look at, you know, in a kind of marketing sense, it looks at what you've bought so far, and then they go like, oh, you've bought all that and that. It's as simple as that. You might like that book, or you might like this thing, or you've been looking at these sites. They would offer you, you know, something that they think you need. It's a kind of a predictive thinking. That has moved also into notions of state violence, where the forensic mode shifted from the past to the future, where you say, these indicators, i.e., if you have bought a ticket to this destination, made phone call to this number, go to this religious institution 7 times, and whatever, something else, use your credit card to buy this, that might be that you will do or will have done something in the future, and we need to act now in order to forestall that. Right? So state forensics very much became a kind of a predictive practice. Again, something that is nothing but, I think, of a contemporary technological variation of phrenology. You said phrenology, what's the connection? Phrenology is kind of, you know, this racist quasi-science of fake science of trying to read your tendency in your skull. You are a murder type or a thief type or whatever. But phrenology is about prediction. It's about a crime that you have not yet done, but you will do, because it's, you know, the future is already somehow could be read from your bones. So I find in this data forensics of the future also a certain dark art in it. There's somehow the dark art of phrenology, or and aspects and elements of it. So we are entering into, when you work in our field, which is a kind of, you know, if you do, like, I often describe it as a Venn diagram between investigative journalism, architecture, and law. No, there's kind of like small points of overlap where we kind of, our small office inhabits. You work in a situation in which information, truth-telling, statements, and violence is not, this is not only for you to do. You exist in a world in which that becomes the way in which politics is articulated. Not only violence against people and things, but statements against it, truth claims, counter-truth claims, etc. So you need to know how to, for us, the very notion of practice-led research is make your knowledge be in the world, right? We're not wanting to do something like, also we do not need like a kind of a forensic specialist on something that is long gone. This is part of a reality as it is unfolding. And it's, so you produce the knowledge or produce whatever research and get slapped back, right? But getting the slap back teaches you something, no? Because you provoked something into being. And then you move again. So it becomes a much more tactical kind of approach and engagement with situations.
I think we have quite a series of questions, maybe in the front row first, and then I see two over there, lady, one, two over there as well. So
Should we take?
maybe we could take 3 questions and then answer them because they might be overlapped. Start.
Okay. So I wonder, since you're being commissioned by, let's say you have a client, I wonder, let's say in the case of, I don't know, to go for Germany or Israel, but let's say in the case of Israel, were you commissioned by the police to investigate the innocence of the policeman or the Bedouins in the Negev to prove that the police were in the fault? And I wonder if in such a case, let's say you find evidence that goes against your client, meaning that proves that the other side is, like, how do you pursue that? Like, what do you do, since you're basically, you're kind of a lawyer and an investigator and a higher force that puts all of these in some kind in a box? What do you do when it goes against your client?
Then there's someone behind you.
I mean, one question I think which is unclear to me in general is, although I find it very interesting, is that in some of the contexts, I think you are using a very objective kind of evidence method in the context of, I think, an issue which, you know, on a wider scale is not as objective in its understanding. And I mean, without giving specific examples, but rather, I mean, has it ever been the issue that it's not, you know, how effective is it when I can identify, I think, the breaches in international law, but actually in the wider agency of things, maybe it is my understanding of that breach which might be a problem, I think.
Then here on the right.
One of the things which you addressed during the beginning of the talk, the relationship between forensic and the forum, takes us back to the very old question of the very old architectural question of creating the public space. But at the same time, your project is somehow situated at a very particular period of time in which the bourgeois public space is experiencing a high crisis of dysfunctionality, which I think that your project somehow also tries to address the dysfunctionality of the public space as we know it and create a different kind of forum for discussion and conversation in a world in which noise has kind of replaced the voice and the dialogue. But what is intriguing and somehow a question for me is that you somehow take it back to the beginning of the problem by trying to address institutions of bourgeois public space, particularly the law, institutions of citizenship and citizen subject, which are somehow already defined or completely controlled by mechanisms which are very difficult to overthrow. In a sense that you try to, I mean, your projects always counter the narrative which is already there, and that's obviously very productive. I don't say anything against how useful that is. But what happens to the question of what is it that makes those narratives even possible? What would be the architectural solution to prevent those narratives from taking place from the beginning?
Okay, so maybe we take these three, not
Yeah, no,
necessarily
thank you.
in
Excellent.
the
Really,
order.
really excellent, somehow related questions. I'm grateful for your trust in that we should answer very important questions that are outside our scope. But I think I can also engage with it. But I'll come back to that through the two questions about objectivity, which are very important, I think. But also, in order to engage them, I need to tell you how we get commissioned, and how we are funded. I mean, there's 15 to 20 people working. We're still recruiting, by the way, if anyone wants to apply. So we have 3 tiers of funding. We have research funding. We have a very large grant from the EU, which is about establishing the technical, theoretical ground of what becomes forensic architecture. What they want from us is not run-of-the-mill investigations, but innovation. Every investigation we should do on that grant need to be different than the previous one, right? We cannot do the same type. You get a technique and simply apply it again. That is that level of funding. Then we have human rights funding, like basically civil society groups. And then we have people coming to us, commissions. And this is increasingly the way we fund things, is people pay for the truth. People pay for work. Now, of course, we would charge big organization like the UN, like Amnesty, or like prosecutors, but we always have a very large, at least a third, if not higher, of pro bono work that we do. And what we did in Palestine, or in fact all the work in Palestine is pro bono in that respect. So that is, although we were working with and for the inhabitants of al-Khiran in that particular moment. So then that comes to the question of objectivity. We're not the judges in any particular situation. It's a very situated kind of research and very situated kind of action that has its clients that you work for, like you're the lawyer that works for them. So there is a notion, I think, that is no longer productive of objectivity, right, as the kind of ethos, scientific ethos of the 19th century. The fact that the subject even, I mean, regardless even of politics, the subject is the inhibitor to the way that knowledge would manifest through the scientists, as if the scientists need to be just a neutral conduit for phenomena existing in the world that are recorded in a particular way. It was very much connected to very Victorian ethos of disciplining the scientists to be objective. Objectivity was a characteristic of the subject. There's a very good book by Lauren Dustin and Peter Gallison on that, which I recommend to all of you to read. But even within science, the idea of activist science, of fighting your corner, is very important. And I think for us, if we were simply uninterested observers, we would never go to the length that we go to work like 4 months over 2.5 seconds, or a year over 1 day in Gaza, or something like that. You need to be completely committed to a cause. And what you do when the stuff doesn't add up is you chuck it. And you start again. And we've done it many times. We do not, we would not publish, or we would not state in a testimony in a particular situation something that we cannot stand behind. because that's not serving in any way, not our clients or our collaborators or whoever. Now, those two other questions, I think, somehow can join on the issue of what you do. I mean, do you by bringing a claim to court, do you accept the validity of the court? Do you actually support that normative framework, bourgeois or otherwise, right? I mean, I think somehow both of you, and for us, this is a dilemma that we continuously face, right? We were, for many years, I'll continue to speak about Israel because that has been the case, and actually the whole kind of forensic dilemma chapter is dealing with issues of what you do when the violence is the law itself, when the law is there to dispossess, when the law is there to reinforce hierarchies, whether economical or racial or whatever, when the law becomes a tool of occupation, when the law becomes the mean of dispensing violence, a kind of a manual of violence, obviously, to do that. Well, you have sometimes very practical dilemmas. Do you actually go to court? And in fact, after many years of doing work for Palestinian bereaved families that ask us to do work, we now refuse to go to the Israeli military courts, for example. We do not produce evidence for this context because we believe that they are reproducing the violence. But that does not mean that a gradient of complicity does not exist with other institutions, with the UN, with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. You know, what kind of liberal values do they kind of promote, etc. The game, I mean, if you are, it's as simple kind of as that. If you want to be a critic, you can do that. And you know, the last book I've written before starting Forensic Architecture is called The Least of All Possible Evil, and it's exactly showing how human rights organizations and international law becomes a kind of a mechanism of displacement and dispensation of violence, etc. The minute that you want to enter, you do not act within a sort of a purity of a situation. You need to judge every situation anew, right? Complicity is always a gradient. You always, the minute that you enter into the political field or even in the juridical field, you will become complicit. The question that you ask, am I serving my political aim or the aim of my client, or I'm making it worse for them? Can we debate that? And if you do it, how do you do it? It's a question of practice. How do you put a claim that simultaneously look at the violence that is saturated in law and claim for violation of the law as if the law is a normative frame that would be otherwise reified by your accepting it, etc. There's all sort of techniques. We were looking at many lawyers, including our great and most favorite one, Jacques Vergès. There's a great film on his work, a lawyer that was called The Terror's Advocate, I think the film. And on people that are kind of like working with and against the law simultaneously. It is not coming out of naivety. It is coming out, it's the pain of understanding the limitation of all institutions that we are, and also understanding something very simple. The minute that you put in an existing forum that something that was not seen or heard or articulated in a particular way, it's no longer the same forum. You can you transform it by what becomes visible in it. And a lot of our evidence, when we present, very practically, there's before the split-second decision, there's like the first line of disqualification. You guys, who are you? I mean, look at your CVs. When you present for court, you need everybody's sort of bio and CVs and where they went to school, etc. You bunch of clowns. What does it mean, like, this guy's MFA, that is architecture, AA, what's the AA? Where I studied, I mean, it's like, it doesn't look serious. And you need to say, no, art, architecture, aesthetic practices is a form of expertise. When the most common kind of evidence that appears in the world right now is images coming from war zone, it is image practitioners that would be best suited to do it. When violence is urban, it is architects, perhaps. Right? Although architect is a good camouflage always, because it kind of appears a bit more serious than the rest of the people. But, you know, we have, it's kind of an agent's best disguise, to use William Burroughs' sort of term. But it's also, and then they would say, okay, so, you know, the next level would be, well, this technology is unverifiable, this is new technology, is not presented in court. So the minute that you kind of bring, for example, social media for the first time into the ICC, it's like you expanded the amount of voices that it could hear. You challenge the notion of expertise, of the production of evidence. It becomes a kind of a social thing, right? Both the production of evidence as a social thing through a kind of a community of practice, some of them people like uploading or sending us stuff, some people synthesizing, some people presenting. The production of truth, if you like, is a social political product. That is a set of relation between people when you produce it and when you present it and act upon it. And these are things that you need to defend, to continuously defend. And the defense of them, when we've got the court to look at particular thing that they have not been looking at in the past, that something else, small maybe, has entered. And it's no longer the same space that it was.
I think we have in the North Jury room 2 or 3 questions. Maybe we could move the microphone
Oh, the mic is here.
over there.
Cool. Okay. Thank you both. Very potent talk. I had a question about your approach and how you navigate in the initial stages of the investigation, the testimony of the individual, and then weighting that and validating that against how you use the sort of architectural spatial information as testament also to the claim. And are there any methods you use to engage with either witness or other people in person to enable them to engage with the information to help you sort of unravel the claim? And do you use any like forensic linguistics approaches, or how do you deal with the people?
Maybe we take again 2 or 3 questions in a row.
Hi, I wanted to ask about once the project leaves your hands and you've gathered the evidence and you've kind of come to this point of processing the available data, and there is almost if it's outside of a courtroom, let's say, that there's a presentation of a almost middle ground where you anticipate a sort of participation. And I wonder about the architecture of that and how your practice sort of negotiates that sort of middle ground space when you're actually anticipating an audience on behalf of your client through negotiating the images produced through your practice.
I'm blind there. You are beyond the threshold of detectability. Is there another question maybe from the floor? One more here, and then we have.
I guess mine probably drops into the middle of those two quite neatly, because I was interested in the sort of role that visualization and modeling has in producing convincing evidence, and what the threshold of demonstrability might be, and how that relates to visuality, which relates to what you were saying earlier about aesthetic practice.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. I think that when I started thinking about forensics, my first book was on Mengelé's skull. That's somehow the kind of how I got to it. And the idea was, which I was wrong obviously about, there was a certain forensic turn, that is a shift from cultural and juridical concentration on witness testimony, very much in a sort of postmodern law, let's say, I mean, in a kind of beginning in the 60s, where expertise and evidence and science started to be supplemented and to a certain extent overpassed by memories of victims, especially when we look at situation of war crimes and human rights groups. In fact, human rights groups were completely, the formation of human rights organizations, Amnesty in the 60s and Human Rights Watch in the middle of the 70s, went hand in hand with this methodological shift towards testimony, right? So human rights methodologies is going to places and asking people what they've experienced. And for human rights groups, testimony is more than just epistemological approach, i.e. to know what happened, but an ethical and political one, right? It was about the individual's speech against repressive state violence. Therefore, the kind of the refusenik or the dissident was the very object of it in the 70s, very much. People oppressed by totalitarian regime, the voice of the individual as the force, the ethical force, to do that. And then we were, so this is kind of like 60s, 70s, and we were thinking, now there is a forensic turn in which an object-oriented juridical culture begins, tuned to matter and code and image, etc., the things that we talked about before. And I think slowly we start understanding that these categories are much more entangled than they are. First of all, when somebody takes smartphone footage of something and something happens, people always speak. They always say something. And so you have already an image which is voiced over, right? There's speech and image together. This is one level of it. And sometimes also, the image itself, the blares, the shakiness of it, becomes in court very much a record of the subject that takes that image, right? So courts became attuned to the fact that cameras record from both ends. They record the things that the lens is looking at, and they record the movement of the photographer, right? You say that's obvious, no? If somebody moves fast, it would do this. But the fact is that it's a photograph of your movement. The blur in the image is a photograph of your movement. It's almost like you're looking at the image through a halfway mirror, right? So that the kind of the subject returned through a certain kind of image analysis. Then we got into projects where we started realizing that architecture exists between the subject and the object, or between forensics and testimony. And in particular, that kind of threshold of detectability that we spoke about before, governments and state militaries affecting violence where it is invisible to see, or they try to go under the threshold of detectability, meant for us in one of our biggest projects so far that we had to reconstruct an entire architecture of a Syrian torture prison, which was a black hole. Nobody, all the prisoners, of course, and the guards, but no independent, no journalists, no human rights, no ICRC visits, etc. No one knows, it's a black hole. And we realized that architecture becomes a way in which not only we're going to build that building or model of the building from the memory of the witnesses, but that architecture enables testimony that was otherwise hidden also to the witness herself or himself, right? That there is a way in which making technical the acts of description, sitting and watch this. I mean, there's the investigation is online and you could see it. The process in which the witnesses sit in front of computers and building, of course, together with an Arab-speaking modeler, basically building every element that they describe in meticulous details. They say the floor tile was that, and then over it a little bit. And all of a sudden, out of the so-called evidence springs a new testimony that was simply not, was repressed by trauma or by other mental mechanisms of, in which it was not manifesting itself before. So then out of that, we started learning that the evidence could be extremely productive in opening up and inducing certain kind of testimonies that were simply not there before. So the modeling process is not a representation of the prison, it's a method of recollection, or the kind of evidence reconstruction that we do in a scene would be presented later back to the witnesses and think, okay, yes, now that you show it to me like this, I can understand that. We're working now with Amnesty on a project that is not yet out and I cannot discuss. They've been working for 2 years on researching something, and they asked us to continue. And we simply shifted the kind of the questions that we asked the witnesses to be asked. And that shift led to a set of new information that is now at the center of what we do. Evidence and testimony are mutually constitutive. Every bit of evidence, anyway, that you present in court, you present it through the voice of an expert, which is also a witness. It's an expert witness. Matter speaks or ventriloquized through its presenter. And that form of ventriloquy is, again, another entanglement. You cannot say that is an object and a subject is narrating. There is a unit which is an object-subject that produces a certain statement. And one produces the other. The object produces recollection in a subject, and the subject ventriloquizes the object in a certain way in which they become entangled. So I think this is a long answer to this very good question.
So this is the launch of Forensic Architecture, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability, distributed by MIT Press and, of course, published by Zoom Books. And I think that the conversation maybe will be nice to have them continue while we move to the South Jury Room and look at the book, and maybe you can have a direct look at the stack of books and make one yours. And it's a book launch. We have to advertise, buy it. You will be rewarded in your life. But before doing that, please join me again in thanking Eyal for coming back at the Architectural Association once again.